Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Scott Horton about Hillary Clinton and her foreign policy views. Mr. Horton is the host of the Scott Horton Show, which mostly focuses on topics related to foreign policy, and he is assistant editor for antiwar.com. You can follow his work at scotthorton.org, and you can find him on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Mr. Horton will also join us again in a couple of weeks to discuss Donald Trump and his foreign policy views. For more information on this episode, please see the show notes page at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Hillary-foreign-policy. Scott, welcome to the show.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Great. So we're going to try and just get into both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, especially because they both seem like that's going to be kind of the 2016 matchup, and just see what have both candidates said in terms of foreign policy. So let's start with Hillary Clinton. She did a ton of stuff when she was Secretary of State. I want to go kind of farther back in her history. So what really did how have Hillary Clinton's views changed, I guess is the question I'm asking, from before she was Secretary of State going into becoming Secretary of State? What types of things was she saying in the past, like in the 90s?
Well, yeah, I would say she wasn't any better as a senator on the issues than as Secretary of State. And as First Lady in the Bill Clinton presidency in the 1990s, I actually don't know what her stance was on Haiti or Bosnia, but I know, and this is, I think, really important, that she convinced Bill Clinton to launch the Serbia war to guarantee the independence of Kosovo under the rule of a bunch of bin Ladenite Kosovo Liberation Army gangsters and terrorists and killers. And it was all over. You may or may not remember 99. It was a big fake massacre, just like Libya in 2011, only instead of, well, I'll get to that in a minute, I guess. In this case, they lied and pretended that 100,000 Kosovar ethnic Albanian civilians had been slaughtered by the Serbs. It was completely made up. And when the war was over, the FBI even and the international inspectors and everyone else went looking for the mass graves, and all they found was 2,000 bodies. Most of those were fighting-aged males, and it wasn't at all clear that they had even been killed before the war started. All reports were that whatever ethnic cleansing was taking place, at a last-ditch effort at the border region or whatever, started when the bombing started. So the whole thing was over a myth, and simply made matters worse, and then guaranteed the independence of Kosovo under the rule of this guy Thasi, if that's how you pronounce it right. I've only ever read it. I don't know if I've ever heard people talking about him. But anyway, he's been found by the European Commission and others for being, he has been found by them to be an arch criminal, an absolute gangster, heroin dealer, and even organ thief and smuggler. And you can look into that. You just type in Kosovo, EU, organ smuggling, and you'll get a whole bunch of very official results from their investigation of all of that. So that's who they guaranteed that war for. And according to her biographer, Gail Sheehy, Hillary Clinton bragged and took credit that she made Bill do it, basically. And at least it seems to me, I'm trying to remember, because I think I used to actually know this for a fact, and now I'm reduced to seems to me, unfortunately. I'll have to go back and look. But I believe somewhere back there in the back of my head is the understanding that it was over the Kosovo War that they actually made up after the Monica Lewinsky scandal of 1998 and his acquittal in the Senate. It dragged into 99. He was actually impeached at the beginning of 99, and then he had the Senate trial. It was after the Senate trial that they went and did this war basically as a victory lap and as a way for them to start getting along again after, their estrangement over the sex scandal. And so that's who she was, at least as of 1999. I don't know what her position was on the Bosnia War and, occupation of 94, 95. I know that she urged the Justice Department to hurry up and get this damn Waco thing over with. And the last time, that was in 1993, and the last time she was anti-war, and that included the Delta Force, that counts as war. But the last time I know of that she was anti-war would have been Vietnam. And I've actually only ever just heard that she was against Vietnam, but I've never seen any concrete examples of that or anything like that. But supposedly she was against Vietnam back 45 years ago, if that makes you feel better.
Well, was she? She was a big Goldwater supporter back then, and of course he was.
Well, that was 64, though. I mean, I think we're talking probably, 69, 70, that, later on in the Vietnam era.
Okay,
but you're right.
So after it started.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the real escalation came after 64. Well, I mean, it was a ratchet effect, of course, and it makes sense that she would have moved to the right. I mean, moved to the left in her college years and that kind of thing. But then, so as a senator, it was clear as soon as she became a senator, she wanted to get on the Armed Services Committee because she needed foreign policy warmonger chops, because that's how you get credibility in D.C. is you got to prove that you were there and you were for killing people when it was a question of whether to kill people or not. And so that was her first priority, was to get on the Armed Services Committee. It was clear from the moment she started running for Senate that she was really running for president. And, everybody better make way for her. So that was been her agenda this whole time. And that's why she voted for the Iraq War. For people who don't remember this, or, you were too young at the time or whatever, the context was very, very clear that John Kerry and Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and quite a few other Democrat senators had learned the hard lesson of the first Gulf War, that it was embarrassing that they had opposed it. And Bill Clinton was only a governor at the time, but had publicly opposed the first Gulf War and had tried very mightily to live that down in the 92 election and got away with it by focusing on the economy and stuff. But it was to his everlasting shame that he opposed the heroic, wonderful Operation Yellow Ribbon, the decisive and conclusive Iraq War I that ended once and for all back in 1991. And so they made the political decision, all of them, in 2002, that they were going to bet that the war would be good politics, and they weren't going to make that same mistake again. And that's why they voted to support it. It's not that Hillary and Bill sat and had a real heart-to-heart and decided that they agreed with Paul Wolfowitz that Saddam Hussein was best friends with Osama bin Laden and was going to give him chemical weapons to destroy us all, or any such nonsense. It was purely politics. So when she says things like, well, that vote was a mistake, pure and simple, that's exactly what she means. It was a mistake. She made the wrong political decision. If she had known better, if she could go back, she would have voted no on it so that she could say now that she had. Simple as that. That's all it is to her. 1 million rotting corpses and 1 million widows and, 1 million fatherless kids mean nothing to her. Right? The grief, the rise of the Islamic State, all the consequences, everything that came from Iraq War II, whatever. The only thing she regrets about it is that it made her lose the primaries to Barack Obama in 2008. Otherwise, she would have been our ruler for the last 7 years. And anyway, so that's all she means by oops about that, is it cost her personally, and her ambition was set back because of that vote. She voted against the surge in 2007, and she was a big cheerleader for, every appropriation and every bit of supporting the troops and all of that. Oh, and by the way, she lied too. She didn't just say, well, I believe Bush if he has secret information. She did not go read the NIE and the classified version, which she could have read by the CIA. She definitely knew better. And if you watch her speech, her Iraq War vote speech, she sits there and claims with a straight face what she had to have known was a lie, if we can assume that she was briefed by her president husband, who had been the last president on the issue. And she sat there and lied with a straight face and claimed that Saddam was tied to Osama and that Bush was right, that there was a risk that Saddam would give weapons of mass destruction to Osama to use on us. Sounds just like Dick Cheney. Total nonsense. Anybody who wasn't a liar or wanting to be lied to at the time knew better, too. I mean, that goes for 150 million Americans who saw through that lie and refused to support the war, at least until it started back then. And that's how transparent nonsense that was. 150 million dunderheads knew better. 150 million bought it, but anyway. And then, so she opposed the surge, but she later admitted to Robert Gates that it was only for political reasons for the primary election of, or for maybe just the general, I don't know, of 2006, her Senate reelection effort. And she was real sorry about it. And it was her big regret that she opposed the surge, but she swore it was just politics. not any heartfelt decision on her part. And then, of course, Afghanistan, she's been just as guilty as anybody in Congress on supporting the war in Afghanistan all along. And then that would also go for, at least keeping her mouth shut, if not outright support for Bush's proxy war in Somalia, and, the rest of the madness of the terror war, the torture regime, the NSA spying, every bit of the lawlessness and assassination that George Bush, instilled and installed, and that she absolutely did nothing about, including even raise her voice against it. According to, if you can believe them, the New York Daily News has a quote from her. It seems credible if you read it, of her saying, "Yes, I'm for torture, in specific circumstances where it's a ticking time bomb scenario." Well, pardon me, but that's every pro-torture monger's excuse, is a ticking time bomb scenario, which is total nonsense, has never happened in the history of all terrorism and torture and ticking bombs. But anyway, so she's even on the record of, if not outright supporting the Bush-Cheney torture regime, when it came down to them asking her, yeah, but what if there was a ticking bomb? She says, yeah, of course, torture. If there's a ticking bomb, we have to. All that. So I don't know if you want to ask me another question now, or you want me to just kick into her years as Secretary of State.
Well, yeah, I want to mention on the Kosovo thing, I've heard that too, about her and Bill making up. She went and talked to him for several months, and then all of a sudden the opportunity to bomb Serbia came along, and she was happy to talk to him. And on the Bosnia thing, I guess that this doesn't indicate what her position was, but I know in the last campaign she got in trouble for lying about landing in Bosnia under sniper fire, when in reality there was just a red carpet laid out on the tarmac waiting for her.
Right. Yeah, one of them Brian Williams stories of hers. Oh, was that your story or something that happened to you, and now I'm telling it to you? Oops. Yeah, they get caught sometimes, don't they?
Yeah, but yeah, let's get into her time as Secretary of State, because there's so much to go through there and so many horrible things.
Yeah. Okay, well, so the first priority really was, well, I guess we start with Guantanamo. They were both senators, Hillary and Obama, but she had been there much longer. And if Obama had really meant to close down Guantanamo Bay, he could have made a real push in that first 100 days, and he could have sent her over there to say to the senators, listen, we absolutely have to do this. And there's a piece in the Washington Post. It's kind of hard to find, but if you add Glenn Greenwald to your search, you'll find the Salon.com article that he wrote years ago about it, where they have the quotes from the Democrat senators explaining how they started sticking their neck out and really working to close Guantanamo Bay, but then Obama did absolutely nothing, said nothing, lifted not a pinky finger to help, to do anything, to pressure anyone, to corral anyone, to make it an issue at all. And so they realized, wow, all day long, right-wing talk radio in my town is calling me a traitor to America on the side of the terrorists for sticking my neck out on this, and the president hasn't even got my back, so forget it. And they all dropped it. And so that was it. And that's why we're having this conversation right now, almost halfway through 2016, and the Guantanamo Gulag is still sitting there open, even though that was his campaign, was to close Guantanamo, to undo all of the criminal Bush excesses. That's exactly what he didn't do on that. And she could have played a role. I don't know if she played a role in talking him out of doing something about it. Wouldn't surprise me. But the two of them absolutely could have gotten that done. And if anybody had cried about it, they could have said, yeah, pardon me, this is why we just beat John McCain in a landslide election, because this is what the American people said they wanted, so screw you. And then they could have just done it. And, I mean, that would have been it. The Republicans wouldn't have been able to do anything about it. And instead, the Republicans, he has signed bills, appropriations bills, where they have attached riders that say he can't spend money closing Guantanamo, removing anyone from Guantanamo. So he allowed them to hem him in, and it's all his fault and hers too. So, okay, but then the next biggest, most important thing is the Afghan surge, which everyone in the whole world knew could never work. We're fighting for a coalition minority government that has hardly any natural constituency inside Afghanistan at all. And the Iraq surge, which didn't even really work as far as what it was supposed to accomplish, in terms of political reconciliation, at least in the Iraq War II, the surge did help the Shiite majority finish winning the civil war against the Sunni minority and kicking them all out of Baghdad. So at the end of that, they could say, well, look, it's the peace of desolation, right? These corpses aren't even screaming anymore because they're all the way dead. And so I can't hear anything. It's peace. But there was no prospect that that was going to happen in Afghanistan, not one bit. And the Taliban aren't going anywhere. And America's allies, the Pakistanis, got to keep backing them because we keep backing their enemies, the Indians and their allies in Afghanistan. So the Taliban were in a perpetual motion machine. None of those political dynamics had changed. And then all they did was add an extra 60,000 troops. And it was in the Washington Post. The guy's an Indian writer whose name I can't memorize pronounce to memorize. But the book is called Little America. And in fact, if you search Jason Ditz, D-I-T-Z, you will find Jason's write-up of the Washington Post article at antiwar.com, where there was a CIA report. I don't know if it was exactly an intelligence estimate or what, but it told Obama, don't bother surging into Afghanistan. It won't work. And he knew that's what it said, and so he didn't read it so that he could go ahead and go along with the political pressure from his own Secretary of State and Generals Petraeus and McChrystal, who were leaking to the media that, our wimpy dithering president won't go ahead and make the commitment and get this thing done. And she really was outright allied on the side of the Pentagon against the president. And he should have stood up to them all, and he didn't. It's his responsibility. But she was a huge part of pushing for that surge policy in Afghanistan. If you're gonna end the Iraq war, there's no way you can end the Afghan war too. We got to double down. Call it the good war and double down in Afghanistan. And all they did, guys, was kill tens of thousands of extra people who otherwise wouldn't have died, including another 1,200 something Americans who died in fighting the war over there. And never mind the tens of thousands of maimed in the IED explosions, losing their legs, losing their genitals, but living, so they could stay alive in Walter Reed for the next, 40 years. All that grief, unremarked upon on TV. If you only watch TV, you might not even be conscious of it at all. But there's been an entire disastrous doubling down of the Afghan war this whole time for nothing. And right now, the Taliban rules more of Afghanistan than they have at any time since 2001. And that's why, even though the war was supposed to end at the end of 2014, there's still 10,000 troops and 5,000 mercs and all the drones because they can't pull out. Because if they leave, it'll be like the fall of Saigon, and the Taliban will take back over the country. And so he's just going to leave it to his predecessor, the same as Bush did, or his successor, the same as Bush did.
Yeah,
get in there.
If you watch TV, you think that it worked. Not only do you not know how much it didn't work, you think that it was completely successful.
Yeah, why not? People take their cue really from what's missing, right? Well, geez, I haven't even heard them mention the Afghan war in forever. Is that even still going on? Who knows? I don't know. And then, so I need to hurry up. I can tell I'm going too slow. She tried to convince Obama to stay in Iraq, even without the status of forces agreement that would have given our troops immunity that the Iraq government refused to give. And she pushed for at least let's build some air bases in Kurdistan. Let's do something. We got to stay there. And then right at the time, and this is almost a mystery. It's so crazy. It sounds like it must be nonsense, but it's really the truth that just as they're killing Osama bin Laden, they're turning right around and they're backing his men in Libya and in Syria. And, just like the foundations of Al-Qaeda came from the leftover mujahideen from the 80s Afghan war against the Soviets, well, this was a worry. In fact, I found an old article of mine I wrote in 2005 that said, what's going to become of all the Saudis and Libyans and Syrians and everybody who's come from across the Middle East to go to Iraq to fight against our guys when they go home? Well, now we know the answer. They went home to Libya, and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama took their side. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, as you know them from Iraq War II, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's suicide bomber butchers. And they helped them overthrow. They sent in the Special Forces and the Air Force, NATO air power, and they fought an air war. It took them 9 months to finally finish the job, but they killed Gaddafi. They overthrew the government, and they turned all of North Africa to chaos. There are now 3 competing governments in Libya, none of which are the government of anything other than, their own members, basically. And there are at least hundreds more armed militias than that without, any kind of central control. It's not necessarily a total war of all against all, but it's not going to be anything like peacetime for any time in the indefinite future. And that includes as now a beachhead for those declaring their loyalty to the Islamic State. I should also mention that in 2012 and 13, in the aftermath of the Libya war, some of the guys who fought for Gaddafi were Tuaregs, ethnic Tuaregs from the country of Mali in the Western Sahara Desert. And they went home where they had basically autonomy from the quote-unquote central government run by black Africans in the South, supported by the French. Well, when they got home from Libya, they brought their guns with them. And they said, you know what? Autonomy is not good enough. Let's declare independence. And so immediately a war broke out. The sort of kind of pseudo-democratic government of the southern part of the country was overthrown by the military. And then shortly thereafter, the jihadis came down from Libya. The victorious jihadis came down from Libya, marginalized the Tuaregs, hijacked their revolution, and marched all the way down into the south of the country, which finally provoked the French military to reinvade the nation in 2013, where they still fight. And that entire area of northern Mali is the size of Texas, which, if you're not familiar, is humongous. And it's this huge landmass in the Western Sahara Desert, in Western North Africa there, south of Algeria, southwest of Libya. And those jihadists from the Mali War have already spread their weapons, ideology, and know-how down to Boko Haram, which already existed in Nigeria, but now are that much worse with, Saudi ideology, weapons, and tactics basically in their hands. And then that just means that Obama, of course, is spreading the drone war and put in a base in Niger and a base in Chad. And now they're sending in spies and special forces and maybe a drone base too into Cameroon. And then that's leading to more terrorist attacks. There was just a terrorist attack at a big hotel in Burkina Faso where Westerners, involved in this terror war stay, which I forget how many, a couple score were killed. It's a huge part of the terror war that we don't really hear about. It's the direct consequences of America's aggressive war against Libya in 2011, and then just completely spread, like the map was really up and down, not north and south, and it just flowed like water down the map, and all through West Africa there, guaranteeing, make work projects for special forces from now on. And then, of course, and this is the one that takes the cake. This is the treason that makes Benedict Arnold look like a hero. It's almost unbelievable. And I know it sounds like ridiculous nonsense to people who don't already know the story. But the story is that what America did under Hillary's insistence more than anything else, more than anyone else in the government, in 2011 and 12, was take the side again of Osama bin Laden's men, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and obviously, especially the Syrian veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in their uprising against Bashar al-Assad, who is the fascist dictator of Syria. And the fascist dictatorship, it's a Ba'athist dictatorship, and it's led by the Alawites, are the ethnic group that are at the top of the pile. But their army is largely Sunni, and at least a plurality, if not a majority, of the Sunni population of Syria support the central government. So it is not a simply sectarian war, the Sunni versus everyone else. At least a large percentage of the Sunnis support the government as well, and including they make up a large part of the actual armed forces. And then they're supported by all the Shiites, all the Druze, all the different kinds of Christians, the Marianites and the Chaldeans and the Assyrians and I don't even know all the different kinds of Christians. And the Kurds, they have their own autonomy, but they are against the fall of Assad. They want independence from Assad, but they don't want war against him. And then you have America and the CIA in alliance with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and Israel to support Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. They're called the Al-Nusra Front. And then later, the Islamic State is basically the Iraqi-heavy faction of the Al-Nusra Front that split off and went back to Iraq and, conquered Raqqa in eastern Syria and then went ahead and hurried up and declared their caliphate, quit listening to the bosses of Al-Qaeda and declare their own agenda But for years, for 5 years now, it is absolutely undeniable. It only ever was, guys, plausible, like not plausible deniability from the beginning. That's all it ever was the thinnest layer of deniability. But you can even go back to 2012 and read it in the New York Times that and the Washington Post, the most official newspapers, that all of America's and our allies' efforts to support the rebellion against Assad has benefited the foot soldiers still loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher of New York City, the members of the al-Nusra Front. They're the ones who get all the guns. They're the ones who get all the money. They're the ones who do all the fighting because they're the ones who don't mind dying. And when they talk about the Free Syrian Army and they talk about the mythical moderates, those are basically just a fencing operation. That's the deniable part. Oh no, all we did was give a bunch of money and a bunch of tow missiles to a bunch of moderates who swear that they don't love Zawahiri at all. And then all they do is turn around and give their weapons to the Al-Qaeda guys all day long, all year long, for the last 5 years. And now, that's only oversimplifying. I could continue on. Obviously, times have changed here and there. The Russians have intervened now. The Islamic State was declared in 2014, so now America's on both sides of this war. You would think they'd turn the ship of the empire around and stop backing their enemy when it completely blows up in their face, and you have basically bin Laden himself up there on the balcony declaring himself Il Duce, but no, they still support the Mujahideen as long as they're fighting Iran's enemies in Syria. And what's hilarious about this is that we're still backing Iran's allies in Iraq against the Islamic State. And you literally had a situation in Syria over just the last couple of months where America's Shiite militia allies from Iraq, the Badr Brigade, were in Syria fighting alongside the Syrian army, Russia, and Hezbollah against the CIA-backed jihadists of the so-called Free Syrian Army and Ahrar al-Sham, which is just Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, in alliance with the al-Nusra Front. And then at the same time, you had the military-backed Kurds, the DOD-backed Kurds, also were fighting the CIA-backed Mujahideen. So America's on three sides of an all-terrorist war in Syria right now, where you even have CIA lackeys fighting DOD lackeys.
Now, I know we should probably move on from Hillary's time as Secretary of State, but there are just so many crimes, so I want to ask you about a few more. One, her sabotaging of the Iran deal. Two, the role the U.S. played in ousting Mubarak in Egypt. Three would be the coup in Honduras. And then I also want to ask you about what happened in Myanmar, because the left seems to point to that as being one of her successes. So can you go through all four of those really quickly?
Sure, yeah. And I'm sorry I'm going on so long about all this stuff. Maybe the Trump will have to be part two.
Yeah, maybe. She's just got so many crimes and so much blood on her hands that.
Yeah, it is. No, I mean, she really is something else, man. To me, I can't think of a worse person other than, I guess, maybe George Bush and Dick Cheney in the whole world. I mean, she's as bad as Baghdadi. She made him. So anyway, Iran deal, 2010. Well, first of all, in 2009, Obama was working on a nuclear deal, but not very hard. And he had promised the Israel lobby that he was a hard deadline by the end of 2009. The Iranians better back down and start doing what's demanded of them by the end of his first year, or else here come the sanctions. And it really wasn't Hillary. It was the Israelis who used, and you know what? I guess it's kind of iffy whether it was the CIA or whether it was the Israelis. Apparently, it was the Israelis posing as the CIA who recruited Jundallah, which is nothing but Iranian Al-Qaeda, really. They're basically an Al-Qaeda clone group in western Pakistan and eastern Iran. And in October of 2009, just as they are negotiating the deal, Jundallah, at the behest of the Israelis, kidnapped and executed, I think it was 10 or a dozen senior Iranian military officials, generals. I mean, can you imagine if that happened in the United States of America? Some foreign terrorists kidnap, a couple of trucks full of generals and execute them? What that would mean for our politics in this country? Well, what it meant in Iran was the deal is off, dude. We're not doing it. And then Obama, the lying bastard, pretended to out the Iranians for having a secret uranium enrichment facility at Qom, which was not secret at all. The Iranians had declared it to the IAEA. There wasn't even the slightest bit of nuclear material had been introduced. It was just an empty hole in the ground at the time. There weren't even any machines installed there yet. And they declared it to the IAEA, and then Obama pretended that he had caught them. But then he had secretly asked Erdogan in Turkey, and I forget the guy's name. Is it Lula in Brazil? Whatever his name was.
Da Silva.
Da Silva, I'm sorry. In Brazil, would they negotiate on his behalf? And at least let's get the 20% uranium out of the country, and that'll be a big first step toward a comprehensive deal. And they had a deal. And what was going to happen was they were going to swap their uranium by way of Turkey to Russia. The Russians were going to give them finished fuel rods, and they were going to ship out the unfinished stuff. And it was going to be an even trade, and it was going to be all good. And then the fuel rods would go right into the machines and would not be available for any further enrichment. And so the Brazilians and the Turks announced their success. This was in either February or March, I guess, maybe even January, beginning of 2010. And Hillary Clinton came out and said, that's ridiculous. That's preposterous. We don't want anything to do with that. And that's stupid and screw you and, something like that. And that was it. The deal was dead. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian president complained that, but I have a letter right here that the president of the United States wrote me asking him to do this. But it was too late. She had already quashed it. And then there's just recently an article in the New York Times that ran last week about Kerry and Hillary Clinton and their divergent paths on the Iran nuclear deal. And if you read it carefully, what you'll see is she was against it. And she did everything she could to stop Obama and Kerry from being successful in negotiating the nuclear deal with the Iranians. And there was a time where Kerry was still a senator and she was still the Secretary of State. And Obama pushed her aside and brought Kerry in to start talking with the Iranians to get the ice broken. And she didn't want to go along with it. And I forget all the great quotes out of there, but they have like her aides talking about how, she really did not want to see the deal done. And, this is the one thing, and especially in hindsight, although I told you all along, this is Obama's greatest accomplishment. And for all the whining and crying and complaining about the Iran deal, none of it has any basis in reality whatsoever. Right? It never was $150 billion. It's more like 50. And it was their money. It was not U.S. taxpayer welfare money to Iran. It was their money that Uncle Sam had stolen from them, that gave them some of it back and then released some of the sanctions, not all, but the nuclear related sanctions. And in exchange for that, Iran has gone from having a civilian safeguarded nuclear program to a civilian double extra super duper inspected and safeguarded and verified, harmless, non-weaponization nuclear program. And so he basically has not changed the nature of their program at all, really. He's changed the nature of the inspections regime and tinkering around the edges. They changed some things about their nuclear program. But mostly what he did was he took the threat of war off the table. He took the American government position that, I don't know, I think maybe you're making nuclear weapons. And he said, no, now I'm satisfied that you're not. Because now that I have you under double extra super lucky happy wish inspection, I know that everything is perfectly fine, which means he's taken war off the table. He was Obama the Great for, 1 week last summer. Him and John Kerry for getting that deal done. Because what that means is, it would take a Hillary Clinton to get us into a war with Iran now. And even then, that's pretty unlikely. And it's over her dead body that he got it done. He had to finally push her out of the way and get John Kerry, of all people, who is like, fourth or fifth for worst person on the planet, to get the thing done. So that just goes to show how horrible she is on that. On the Mubarak thing, I will challenge your characterization of the thing, because what I think happened there was that the people of Egypt overthrew Mubarak, and Obama and Hillary Clinton did everything in the world that they could to keep him there. And Hillary said, Mubarak is my family friend. I love him. He's great. And we don't want to get rid of him. And Joe Biden said, he's not a dictator. What are you talking about? He's the president of the country. And they put it on the front page of the New York Times that what they really would like to do, if the people cannot be placated and they insist on overthrowing him, then they would like to settle for Omar Suleiman, the head of the secret torture police, to be Pharaoh runner-up. And they're going to install him in power. And then failing that would be plan C, would be try to get the labor union left and, the Facebook and Twitterati and see if somehow they could get them. Although obviously they're a very minor force in Egyptian politics and never had anything like a mandate for power. But what really happened was Mubarak polled his junior officers and they reported back that they would not fire on the millions of Egyptians in Tahrir Square. And so that was it. The game was up. They would not clear the square. They would not stop the revolution. They were going to sit back. They were identifying with the people and not the state. And Mubarak's days were up and he had to run. And then that was it. And then they held elections and the Muslim Brotherhood won. And then it was under John Kerry, not Hillary Clinton, that and by the way, they really didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood to win. They really tried to push for, the so-called liberals. You might even remember there were 9 Americans were arrested, including, I forget the guy's name now, but it was one of these Clintonites' sons was over there. And it was basically a USAID, NED type project to try to build up these so-called liberal groups, liberal democratic groups. And it failed and they were arrested and eventually kicked out of the country. The Muslim Brotherhood won the elections, but then they were overthrown, and it was America, Saudi, and Israel who supported the faction inside the Egyptian military that canceled the election results and overthrew Morsi and put him in prison, massacred 1,000 people in the streets of Cairo, and they have arrested and sentenced to death hundreds and hundreds more, maybe thousands more since then, and have reinstated the totalitarian military dictatorship. It's interesting that, the Israelis seem to usually prefer to want to just smash all Arab states into small warring pieces, but not in Egypt. In Egypt, they prefer the stability of and their long-term relationship with the Egyptian military that they have in that relationship there, and they figured that's the best for their security, so that's American policy too. And then plus the Saudis hate the Muslim Brotherhood, so they had all the money to, help agitate against them. And in fact, I interviewed Phil Giraldi, the former CIA officer, in the beginning of 2013, and he said he's hearing that the Saudis are bankrolling rent-a mobs in the streets of Cairo to try to destabilize the city in preparation for a coup against Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, which came about 4 or 5 months later. There was that one. And then Honduras, what happened was the military overthrew the president under the pretext that he was going to try to run for a third term. But he wasn't. He was trying to amend the Constitution to allow for presidents to run for third terms from now on, but that wouldn't have included him. That would have been starting at the next election. His term limit was already up. So it was a total fake excuse. You see what I mean? If our congressmen were trying to pass term extensions for the president, but it said right in the thing that we don't mean for the current president, this could only be for future presidents, and then someone used that as the excuse to, anyway. I just said the same thing twice. You understand what I mean? So they overthrew him on a fake excuse, and all the Organization of American States and everybody condemned the coup and said, bring him back. I think they flew him off to Africa somewhere or something. And they said, bring him back. And Hillary Clinton said, hold it, not so fast. And she used the American influence, U.S. influence in the Organization of American States to quash that effort and instead push for a deal that would call for new elections to be held. And as she put it in her memoirs, that would make the question of the reinstating of Zelaya moot. And what's interesting, too, is she took that passage out in the paperback version, which just makes her look more guilty. Like, why do they even do stuff like that? We still have the hardback. It's right here. You can get it in Kindle online or whatever. And anyway, it's right there where she admits she sided with the coup d'etat and she prevented the president from filling out the rest of his term. And then the consequence of that has been that the new government has, for whatever reasons, been complicit in the rise of, or I don't know, complicit. Maybe they're cracking down and that's making it worse. I don't know exactly what. But Honduras has gone completely to hell since then. And I know that the drug trade through there, I don't mean consumption, I mean the trade going through there has been terribly violent. Can you imagine sending a toddler relative of yours alone to walk across Mexico to try to get to America? How desperate you would have to be to give that toddler a chance to escape violence, that you would send them off on a mission like that. That's what the people of Honduras have been reduced to under the violence. It's the murder capital of the world right now. And then all their environmental activists, they have all these corporations who they want to put in all these dams and, steal property. And, it's a fascist system. And all the left-wing activists standing up to them are being murdered. It's a real catastrophe, a real disaster. The kind of consequence that if it had been George W. Bush, every single Hillary voter would sound like a Bernie voter crying about it, right? But it's their hero who did it, and so they don't want to hear about it at all. Whoever that woman is, that left-wing activist who just got murdered in her bed a month ago, well, she must have been a Bernie bro or something and deserved it somehow. Or, just don't talk to me about it. They don't want to hear it because it's the kind of thing that if the Republicans did it, they would absolutely, obviously condemn it at the top of their lungs.
All right, and how about in Myanmar? What's the truth there? Because the left seems to like pointing to that one as one of her successes.
Well, I don't know everything about that. I know that they, went over there and tried to win the government of Myanmar over to the American side as part of the pivot to contain China. So, yeah, if a new Cold War against China that Nixon ended 40 years ago sounds like a good idea to you, then, yeah, that's a great achievement. I guess, the word is that the military dictatorship eased up a bit. Do they have real elections or anything like that? Or they just, let some political prisoners go? I'm not exactly sure. But as far
I
as...
I think they had some kind of election, and Aung San Suu Kyi, however you say her name, her party is now in charge. So they're hailing this as some great victory for democracy. But I'm always skeptical whenever they say things like that, of course.
Yeah, well, and I don't know about that personally. But I'm absolutely, dubious anytime somebody's going to give any American official or group of officials credit for something like a change of regime from military dictatorship to democracy, unless it was already owned by the Americans and they had to back off, like in the case of Egypt, or like when Ronald Reagan told Ferdinand Marcos that, hey, man, I don't have your back anymore. That's it. You got to hit the road. And accede to Corazon Aquino in the Philippines back in 1986 or whatever it was. But if someone's trying to push the myth on me that Hillary went in there and convinced a bunch of colonels and generals to lay down their arms and voluntarily, give power over to a bunch of happy Democrats and all the human rights concerns are taken care of now and all that, I guess I'd have to see some solid proof. But I do admit to some ignorance there. What's most important about it to me is that the policy has nothing to do with the people of Myanmar whatsoever and everything to do with hemming in China because they abandoned communism. So, if it's all a zero-sum game and all our nations are in competition with each other, then we were all better off with Maoist communism in China. But it's not a zero-sum game. And actually, the entire planet is better off. Every human is better off because the Chinese abandoned communism. But of course, what that means is, and not that they got a free market, it's obviously a very crony fascist system there, but it's a hell of a lot freer than it was. And then so that means record amounts of wealth are being generated there. And so it's the rise of a powerful nation state. It doesn't seem, the Chinese Politburo does not seem to have any real, territorial ambitions. If they're looking at our model, they can see how counterproductive empire is. They have the Soviet model just 20 years past as well. So they'd be fools to really, try to create a military world empire at this point. There's no reason to believe that is their policy, but we've got to contain them anyway, really just because Lockheed needs to sell some planes and our admirals need little ribbons for their shirts.
And what has some of her rhetoric been on the campaign trail thus far?
Invade Syria. That's her main thing, is we have to have a safe zone in Syria. Well, that means invade Syria. And by the way, Donald Trump agrees with her on that. I don't even think he knows what it means. She sure as hell does. And she has not backed off one iota from the ridiculous policy or, pretended understanding or whatever you call it that the problem in Syria is the secular dictatorship and not America and its allies' support for the rebellion there. Again, even almost 2 years now since the declaration of the caliphate and the declaration of war against the caliphate, they still are trying to get rid of Assad. And I think that will be her first priority if you put her in the chair.
All right, so we'll save Donald Trump for another time. We can do a part 2 on him. But just to sum up with Clinton, basically she has a long record of being a warmonger. It doesn't look like any of that is changing, and there are millions of people who are dead because of her actions and millions of people who are refugees because of her actions who otherwise would not be. It's
at least
horrible.
a cool million, if not 2, yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yep.
it's just horrible.
And again,
it's amazing to think that people actually support her.
Yeah, it really is. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, although, again, I kind of apologize by way of disclaimer. I know it sounds like hyperbole, but I'm just telling you it ain't. It's just the math. It's the numbers here. When George Bush invaded Iraq and he gave Western Iraq to bin Laden's men, basically, to be their jihadistan, all of the Anbar province and all the way up to Mosul became lawless Sunni jihadistan for 10 years. That was the dumbest thing anybody ever did. I'm not saying he accidentally started the war. It was a premeditated crime and all that. But that wasn't the deliberate result. They were not trying to create, bin Laden stan in Western Iraq with the invasion of 2003. But what Hillary and Barack Obama did in Libya and Syria was outright high treason. Outright, deliberate taking of the side of men that they knew were veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq who had just finished killing our guys in the last war.
And if you want to know more about the war in Syria, we did do an episode. So if our listeners are interested, that's at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Syria-war with Daniel McAdams. It's a great episode.
Oh, yeah, he's the best.
Yeah, he's great. So yeah, as I said, we'll save Trump for another time because even though he might be better or less bad than Hillary, and then most of the people he was running against in the primary, like Cruz and Kasich and Rubio, all of whom are horrible, he's got a lot of issues when it comes to foreign policy too. So we'll definitely try to have you back so we can do that episode. But until then, how can people follow your work, and what do you recommend people read or check out? Obviously the Scott Horton Show, but is there anything else you recommend people check out if they want to learn more about Hillary and all of her crimes?
Well, listen, I think, all in one place, the very best thing that you can do is read antiwar.com. We've got Eric Garris and Jason Ditz on top of the news all day long. Justin Raimondo writes 3 times a week. Dan Sanchez is our brilliant newest writer there. And, I'm in charge of the viewpoints, the opinion pieces. I pick 6 or 7 of them to run for y'all every day. And, I think, seriously, if you just read news.antiwar.com, Jason Ditz's news summaries of all the daily everything, and you do that regularly for a while, you'll find, you'll look back on the last few months and realize you've really learned a lot, and you really, have gained a lot of context for who's who and who's on what side and why in these wars.
All right. Well, yeah, I definitely agree with you on antiwar.com and news.antiwar.com and how valuable they are. But we mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but can you go over again some of the ways people can follow your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm just at scotthorton.org. I quit the live show. Well, I still do KPFK on Sunday mornings, 90.7 FM in LA. But I quit my live show, but I'm still doing an interview podcast. I admit the last couple of weeks have been really slow. I think the election has really diverted everybody's attention, but I am still trying to get, if I can, 8 or 10 interviews a week for you there. So sign up for the podcast feed. It's at scotthorton.org/interviews.
All right. Well, great. And you're working on a book as well, correct?
Yeah, afraid so. Chapter 1 is done, and I'm into Chapter 2 now. It's I'm writing it with Tom Woods.
Okay. Are you allowed to give our listeners an idea of what's going to be in there?
Yes, it's going to be refutation of the entire terror war from 1979 on.
All right. Well, great. Well, whenever it comes out, we'll definitely have to talk about it with you. And, of course, we'll have you back to talk about Donald Trump and his foreign policy speech and some of his foreign policy rhetoric, both now and in the past. So we'll look forward to that. But I want to remind everybody for this episode to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Hillary-foreign-policy. since we just got to Hillary in this one. It'll be wakeupcallpodcast.com/Hillary-foreign-policy, and we will link to scotthorton.org. We'll link to antiwar.com. All the resources and articles we've discussed over the course of this interview will be there. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Hillary-foreign-policy. And I also want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter. That's at WUC Podcast on Twitter. And on that note, Scott, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to doing this again to tear the Donald to shreds and get to the bottom of what he has to say about these issues.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks very much for having me, and I'm happy to do it anytime.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.